Thank you for the invitation. I am a critical care physician, medical engineer at the University of Iowa. I've been studying mechanical ventilation and lung diseases for many years. Uh, I have a very small startup company, ventilator company called Oscillavent, that was tasked to design a mechanical ventilator prior to the COVID pandemic, and we're funded with a NIH STTR. Unfortunately, all my work with the company, prototype development and experiments, been put on hold. All non-essential research at the university was put on hold. So I did get thrust into dealing with the pending question of ventilator shortage, not only in the state of Iowa, but throughout the country in general. And when I was approached by different people from different institutions, we looked at different possibilities to deal with the ventilator shortage, one of which probably most commonly known is the use of the national stockpile of ventilators, of which there's about 10,000, I believe, but it's questionable how many of these actually work. Many of them have been in storage and have been turned on for about 20 years. So it's estimated maybe 2,000 of these don't even function. Another solution would be to build newly functional ventilators, having existing ventilator companies ramp up productions like Medtronic, Bayer, Draeger, etc. But even a low-end ventilator is going to cost about, at a minimum, $30,000 or so. There's a possibility of licensing the technology to manufacture to other companies that have that capability. But again, there's not going to be much of a dent in the cost there. And then you may have heard throughout the popular press the possibility of having smaller companies build very low-cost, streamlined ventilators, very low-featured for emergency use. And the FDA has granted an EUA to some companies to actually do this. I don't know how effective this is going to be. Ventilators are Class 2 medical devices with the FDA for a reason. They can be very dangerous. It's actually very easy to harm somebody on a ventilator as opposed to sustain them if you don't really know what you're doing. But we looked at the fourth solution that's down here, and that is the possibility of sharing ventilators that are already FDA approved across multiple patients. And of course, this is going to be the ultimate off-label use of any ventilator. And you may have heard about this in the popular press as well. It was done in 2017 in a mass shooting in Las Vegas, and it was featured prominently in the New York Times back on March 26th, in which New York Presbyterian did have to resort to sharing ventilators. You can see here across two patients. This was so concerning that this might have to be done in other regions of the country, that an expert panel was actually assembled and came up with guidelines to actually do this as in as safe a manner as possible. But there's a lot of problems with sharing a ventilator, and I referred to this kind of sharing as naive ventilation, naive shared ventilation. I study how gas volume from a ventilator is distributed throughout a lung, is particularly a diseased lung. So it made sense to me that if a ventilator were going to deliver a volume of gas to different patients, that gas wouldn't be distributed uniformly. And I think you can see that here. If you have a total volume of gas of about 1,500 cc's that's coming out of a ventilator, and ideally you'd like to deliver a third of that to each patient would get 500 cc's. But depending on what the particular disease is, what the mechanical properties of the respiratory system is, that may not happen. Some patients would get too much volume. This patient specifically got about 700-800, and other patients would get too little. So this is the problem with trying to share ventilation and approaching it as just a simple plumbing problem. So our solution that we came up with was to individualize pressure control ventilation. This was a low-cost solution, and we just basically use disposable spring-loaded valves that would crack open at particular pressures, and they're adjustable. So you can adjust the tension on the spring and they would open up and release gas to the patient or to a manifold at different pressures It's very low cost. It allows for individualization of the pressures and the volumes that are being delivered to the patient that may have to, unfortunately, share a ventilator with somebody else. First, to see if this would work, we started out with a computer simulation just to see if we were going to do individualized pressure ventilation, does it superior to what the standard would be, which would be naive shared ventilation. So again, the dashed line is what was coming out of the ventilator in terms of volume. With naive ventilation, the different colored lines, the volumes that are being delivered to 3 different patients. And when we apply our device, at least virtually with the computer simulation, we're able to appropriately adjust the volume that each patient is receiving to 500 cc's. And with the generous support of UI Ventures and some 3D printing assistance with Proto Studios in Iowa, we were able to come up with a prototype to actually do this. This is an example of the spring-loaded valve with the manifold, and how we've placed it onto an actual ICU ventilator on the inspiratory and the expiratory limbs. And we tested this in mechanical test lungs, and experimentally, this actually worked. Wrote it up very quickly and submitted it for publication to the Journal of Respiratory Care on April 7th. And after peer review and some quick revisions, we actually got it accepted on April 22nd. Which, if you know about academic publishing, that this is really lightning speed for something. This might be a personal record for me, but we were very happy to get this disseminated out to the community. So I'm just going to conclude there. I just, when you hear the concept of shared ventilation in the lay press, you need to understand this is more than a plumbing problem. This can sometimes cause more harm than good to the patient, but if it's appropriately individualized, which I think my group has come up with a viable solution, it could be a safer alternative, not just dealing with the pandemic. I don't think we're going to have to be sharing ventilators in the state of Iowa, fortunately, and I think that period in New York is also past. But looking into the future for austere environments where there's scarce medical resources, emergency use of shared ventilation like mass casualty events, or in developing nations where there are some countries, literally, they have less than half a dozen ventilators available and couldn't deal with a pandemic like this. But clearly, if we're going to do clinical translation, it's going to require more development, refinement, and some validation. So at the moment, we're looking at the possibility of phase 1 funding through the SBIR mechanism, either with the NIH or the Department of Defense. And I'd just like to acknowledge the team that worked with me at Iowa, Boston University, University of Cincinnati, and Sullivan to come up with a fairly unique solution, I think, for shared ventilation. Also the support of my Department of Anesthesia and the Chief Innovation Officer at the University of Iowa and his team as well, John Darcy. So